And I want to talk a little bit about some environmentalism and some issues surrounding that as well. You talked earlier about the importance of genetic diversity in flowers for potential drugs and things like that, and food, as we just said. So, yeah, I guess that's the first place to start, is just to talk about the genetic diversity of plants. And
Yeah, so there are an estimated 350 to 400,000 species of flowering plants. We don't exactly know the total number, but just in terms of species that have been named and described scientifically, it's somewhere in that 350,000 plus probably range. That's a huge number of species. For comparison, there are about 11,000 species of birds, 6,500 species of mammals, maybe 30,000 species of fishes, so that there are like 65,000 species of vertebrates total. And here are, 350,000 or more species of flowering plants. And these flowering plants are forming the baseline, the framework for the habitats that our animal life and basically inhabits, right? So whether it's rainforest or desert or temperate forest or grassland, it's, the foundation and the major composition is flowering plants. And so perturbations to that species diversity can be very upsetting to those communities. So, we refer to the biodiversity crisis, which is the ongoing rapid loss of species. I mean, the estimated number of flowering plant species that may be lost by the end of the century is staggering. And I won't mention the number because I'll probably get it wrong, but it's always bigger than what I can imagine. I mean, it's maybe, no, I won't say, but a huge, a huge fraction. And so if we try to imagine our ecosystems without those estimated numbers of plant species, then there will be, some pretty dramatic repercussions. And of course, there's that sort of disruption to the ecosystems and to all of the other organisms that depend on those habitats. But there is also the potential loss of medicinal value through plants that produce secondary compounds or defense compounds that could be important for human health. There are also many crop wild relatives. So for every crop plant that has been domesticated, there's some set of species that form the closest relatives of those crops from which the crops were actually domesticated. And sometimes there might be 5 to 10 of these crop wild relatives. Well, in some cases, we don't know what properties those wild relatives have that could be beneficial for crop improvement, either in yield or resistance to disease or whatever for moving into the future and dealing with problems of food security. But we also have the potential to lose those crop wild relatives before we even, could study them, meaning that we would lose that ability to incorporate any of their beneficial traits into our agricultural products. So the fact that there is so much amazing diversity out there about which we know so little and of which so much is rapidly going extinct is, just a very sobering thought on so many levels. We see the potential for losses of our ecosystems and losses for potential benefits for humankind as well.
do we know the primary drivers of those losses? Just the ones that come to mind for me is climate change, of course, is the big one that everyone's concerned about, but also just like habitat destruction, I assume is also a big one. And then I was also curious about invasive species because I know that's a big issue.
Yeah, you're totally right. There was a study that was issued in 2019 by it's an intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services that was convened by the UN. And they published a report that year on the main drivers of essentially of loss of biodiversity and the services that healthy ecosystems provide. And they identified five different things. And they were changes in land use, habitat destruction, climate change, which interestingly was not the number one factor at that point in time, invasive species and overharvesting.
Mm.
And these didn't apply necessarily only to plants, but to species in general. And so those
Oh.
were I think that was the list that was presented. And then in 2021, there was an updated report that was, sort of emphasized that same thing. But yes, the roles of invasive species in driving other species to extinction. I mean, I see this literally across the street from where I'm sitting right now. We have a conservation area on our campus, and there are some bay trees that are, related to avocado, et cetera. And there was a fungus a beetle that carries a fungus that was introduced from Asia into the southeastern US not that long ago. And it spread and it kills these trees. And so we have, dead young trees, a few living ones, but also some dead ones just right across the street from us. And
Mhm.
you can see and that was the result of, an invasive beetle coming into the US from Asia and carrying its little fungus that lives in its gut. And the fungus is then wreaking havoc on all of our native trees in the avocado family, and potentially will have similar effects on the avocado industry if it gets into them. So the invasive species actually cost, I think it's somewhere around more than $120 billion per year in damages to either native ecosystems or economically important plants, and other organisms as well. Yeah, every year.
So I heard that it's really the rate, because these sort of occurrences always happen throughout history. Animals or plants or whatever find a new environment, and they just happen to be well adapted for it. And then the environment kind of equilibrates around that. Some new species gets integrated then, but I heard now it's just the rate that's happening. It's just throwing so many things off, and it's causing problems. Where is that right? Where it's just things can't equilibrate fast enough to all the changes.
Yeah, it's definitely true. Yeah. So, our global interconnectedness just means that, non-native species are being introduced onto every continent on a daily basis. And despite efforts at quarantine, not everything can be detected. And of course, not everybody knows, like, wow, you don't know what non-native species is going to end up having, that sort of invasiveness associated with it. There's a lot of interesting work that's going on where people are trying to predict which species will actually be invasive in under which circumstances. So, for example, a lot of species from Eastern Asia have been introduced into Eastern North America, and they're very similar climates, very similar habitats, and some of the native plant species are actually each other's closest relatives. So, but under these circumstances, what happens when a plant species from Eastern Asia gets into Eastern North America? Can we predict which of those are going to be invasive and which are just going to sort of, okay, I'll germinate and get along fine here, but not necessarily take off as an invasive? It's not really clear what those characteristics are. So some people have predicted if something is similar to, well, Darwin actually addressed this question too. It was his Darwin's conundrum. Are invasive species most likely to be things that are closely related and very similar to things that are already in an area because they could take off? Or will the things actually be more distantly related because things that are too closely related and similar might be more likely to compete? It seems like anything is possible. Like invasive species are generally defying prediction at this point, unfortunately.
You see both those. Interesting. Yeah, and I know, like, I know some people are somewhat apathetic, sort of survival of the fittest, whatever plants are best suited. Fine, but I always thought it was weird that, like, we in America we get invasive species from Africa and Asia, but in those places they get invasive species from America that are causing problems. It's like, so it's not just like the biggest, baddest ones are winning. It's just like this
Right.
mixing itself is causing issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's, something will get introduced to a new location and it doesn't have its native pests. And whether those pests are microbes, like they're bacteria in the soil, or whether they're fungi, or whether they're things that would eat them or whatever, they don't have their native pests, and so they can do better in their novel environment than any of their close relatives do. And that happens exactly as you mentioned. We've been to Europe. I remember hiking in the Pyrenees and looking down and saying, that's from Eastern North America. It's like, along a trail where you tend to see like weedy species, their weedy species were from Eastern North America, whereas our weedy species might be from Europe. So yeah, it's definitely it's a global issue.
Mhm. This is kind of a weird question. Is that eventually going to have sort of a homogenizing effect on the world, do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, interesting and, potentially sad thought, that diversity that we see in any species, in any group of species, as we go around the world is, tied to both the characteristics of that area and also the history of that area. So like, you go to Australia and it's like everything's different from anything you've ever seen before, right? So animals are different, plants are different. But invasive species have come in there and are, have really wreaked havoc with a lot of the native animals, some of their iconic animals, as well as a lot of the plants. And so if what happens is by invasive species action, you end up losing some of the particularly unique elements of the biota, then the biota becomes much more similar everywhere you go. And yeah, you lose that, all of that beautiful diversity.
Mhm. Okay, that's kind of what I thought, but wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little sad.
Yeah.
And then with climate change, so I've heard that the Earth is actually gotten greener as things have changed and gotten warmer. So I was wondering if it's beneficial for all plants that already exist here, and then are they moving, migrating, basically? They're changing because, climate change, so the climate's changing in different places. And then also, do we see new adaptations as the environment's changing?
Yeah. Yeah. So really, really good questions. So let's start first by considering how plants are responding to a warming environment. So of course, different species are going to respond in different ways, and we can see evidence of species responses just by looking at, well, various sorts of data over the past few decades. I mean, people often, if they've lived in the same place for a while, they might be noticing that certain plants in their gardens don't do as well as they used to. And that things that they didn't used to be able to grow, they're now growing without problem. And so there's a very obvious change in even, let's say, the last 20 to 30 years in terms of what grows well and I'm coming at this from the perspective of the North Temperate region, right? So we see different sorts of responses in different parts of the world. One of the ways that we can actually detect responses of plants to climate change over the last decades to centuries is by looking at current distributions compared to where plant species were collected and made into herbarium specimens. So we have these great institutions called herbaria around the world. There are something like close to 4,000 of them, I think. And they're like museums of plant specimens. So collectors would go out and still do this today, collect a plant specimen, press it with a special type of press, and then put the plant with special glue onto a piece of paper. It's a standardized piece of paper that will persist for a long period of time. And then a label will go on that paper, or on that big sheet of paper. And that label will tell you the species name, where the plant was collected. Ideally, it would give you the latitude and longitude. Now, in the days past, of course, that wasn't possible. But it'll tell you who collected the plant and the date that the plant was collected. And all of that information is now being digitized. And so we have huge databases globally with hundreds of millions of specimens and observations that tell us where organisms occurred at different points in time. So there are somewhere probably around, I don't know, maybe I'll say 70 or 80 million plant specimens that are in these databases. And we can look at the plant specimens for example, in my region in North Central Florida, we can see what occurred here 100 years ago, and we can see whether or not these plants still occur here or not. We can also develop some models of species, of like ideal habitats for species based on where these plants were collected in the past. And we can say, where did those ideal conditions occur now? They might not occur where they were collected. Those ideal habitats are actually shifting a little bit north. And if we actually say, where will the ideal habitat be located in 30 years or 50 years, it's much farther north than where they currently are. And we can do that all on the basis of these observations and specimens that were collected in the past. And so we've been doing that for flowering plants in the state of Florida. And we're finding, unfortunately, that a lot of species will not really have any suitable habitat in even 30 years from now. The conditions will be too hot and too dry based on what they have, what their optimal conditions are. There are other species, though, that are adapted to hot, dry conditions. And when we map out where their ideal habitat is going to be, instead of just this one little strip in the center part of the state, which is where they actually occur now, the ideal habitat is essentially the entire state. So there will be definite winners and definite losers in this sort of, climate lottery that's taking place. But what we mostly see is that the ideal habitats are going to be shifting northward. Now, what this also means, this comes back to the question we were talking about before with invasive species and homogenization. What we're also seeing through this modeling work is that there's likely to be a big homogenization of communities as well. So certain things are just going to drop out because they're not going to make it. Other things are going to be like this one that I mentioned that looks like, oh yeah, it could grow anywhere. And it, whether it can get everywhere, that's another question, but it could be everywhere. And the same thing could be true for some other species. But the sorts of very specific local adaptations and diverse habitats that we have a very highly diverse flora here. It's like patchworks of all of these different habitats, all based on just very small differences in elevation, like literally like this big of a difference in elevation, because it changes the water dynamics. And so whereas in other parts of like North America, you actually have to go up like real elevation to get that sort of difference because of our limestone, very porous soils here. A very small change in elevation can lead to a huge difference in the plant characteristics. So anyway, the bottom line here is that plants have been responding to warming temperatures over the past several decades. And as we project that into the future, it's likely that we will see very dramatic changes just based on the changes in temperature and precipitation.